Before we open the garage today, we want to remind you to check out our website developed by Small Fry Marketing called justbarelychristian.com.
Links to all episodes of The Soul's Garage can be found there, as well as some blogs, graphics, jokes, actually some really good jokes, and other great time wasters while you're checking out the website.
Also, if you want to get in touch with us here in the garage, you can do that as well at justbarelychristian.com.
And this week, we're proud to welcome a new sponsor to the Soul's Garage, Bubba's Dry Cleaners.
That's it. At Bubba's, we won't take responsibility, but we will take your clothes.
Oh, gosh, let's open the garage.
It's a place to work, a place to talk, maybe tell a story or two. It's a place to tinker with belief and ask what's good and true. There are things to keep and things to toss or see them differently. You'll find us in the Soul's Garage. Come share a laugh or three. The Soul's Garage, the Soul's Garage. Whatever your model of faith, let's question, ponder, wonder why on any path you take.
Hello, and welcome to the Soul's Garage. I'm Paris Donahue.
And I'm David Ezekiel, and we've opened the garage door to hang out with you and tinker with this vehicle called faith in order to keep it running smoothly in all of our lives.
Back in 1922, Adolf Hitler said at some gathering, "My feelings as a Christian point me to my Lord and Savior as a fighter."
Really?
Yeah, he actually said that, and many
Wow.
other things. And he also had really very little use for Jesus on the cross. He liked the Jesus that was overturning the money changers in the temple. He really liked that Jesus, but, but not the one who was kind and forgiving and all that sort of stuff. Well, until recently, it's been kind of easy to dismiss statements like Hitler's as saying, oh, well, we know how misguided Hitler was. But now we have a Secretary of War with the words Deus Vult tattooed on his arm, which is a motto from the Crusades of the medieval period, meaning God wills it. And recently he read aloud from a sermon in one of his prayer meetings that he has at the Department of Defense, praying that, quote, wicked souls be delivered to the eternal damnation in the fight against Iran.
Well, you know what? That sounds a lot like what Mark Twain prophesied, shall we use that word?
That's a nice word to use,
or
yeah.
Anticipated,
Yeah.
maybe that'd be a better word.
Yeah.
You know, when he said that history doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And by golly, there seems to be a lot of rhyming these days.
Well, unfortunately, that's true. Now, what we're talking about here is a phenomenon nowadays called Christian nationalism. And to help us explore it, we're delighted to be joined in the garage by Dr. Tom Mockaitis. A little of Tom's pedigrees: he's a professor of history at DePaul University. He's a recognized expert on worldwide terrorism and extremism. He's been an advisor to the U.S. State Department in both Democratic and Republican administrations, and a frequent guest commentator on CNN, PBS, and several local Chicago TV stations.
Which begs the question, why in the world would Tom want to hang out with a couple of hayseeds like us?
Well, yeah, it's a big question. It's huge.
But hey, we're delighted to have him anyway. I mean, somewhere.
Well, you gotta take the work where you can find it, you know. And you go for the audience and so on. And,
right.
If there's any more censorship in this country, I mean, you guys are going to be the only ones left I can talk to, because I'll be kicked off.
That'd be all right. Yeah, right.
Hey.
Yeah. You could always say that when you were looking for somebody to interview you, you weren't looking for much, so that's why you showed up.
Yeah, right. And I work cheap too. You know.
Well, so do we. That works out great. Tom, it's a delight to have you.
Yeah, Tom, great to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me on.
There's a candidate for Senate from the state of Texas right now by the name of James Tallarico, and he defined Christian nationalism as, quote, the worship of power in the name of Jesus, unquote. I'm wondering if you agree with that definition, and if so, could you define Christian nationalism in more depth and outline its characteristics?
Well, he's in part correct. There's no question, and you just said it very well. It's one of those complex things that's more easily described than precisely defined. There's been elements of Christian nationalism going way back to the beginning of the Republic. You know, the New World is the shining city on the hill, and that kind of thing, and so on. And most nations have sort of claimed that the Lord is my shepherd, you know, and that kind of thing. Unfortunately, he's everybody's shepherd, and that does tend to confuse the sheep. But the thing is that it's always been part of our kind of American exceptionalist worldview, but it's really come on, as you noted, like gangbusters, back into the mainstream with the MAGA movement, because the MAGA movement really is, you know, about make America Christian again, as well as make America white again. That's what it means.
Sure.
But Christian nationalism is the presumption, and I think that's a good word, that we are, if not God's unique chosen people, a chosen people with a special message and a special mission to go out and do God's work in the world, particularly when Pete Hegseth and our speaker, Mike Johnson, who keeps the appeal to heaven flag, you know, from the American Revolution outside of his office, you know, insists that, you know, we are in this Manichaean struggle between good and evil's anybody who disagrees with the current administration,
Exactly.
which may be many of us. And you know, and unfortunately, you know, something like 2/3 of evangelicals they allegedly believe this, but I think in some elements of it are much wider. The Americans like, well, we are pretty special, and we always do try to do good and that kind of thing. But anytime you see religion being appropriated, it's dangerous. When I was in Bosnia and Croatia right after the war, there was a bishop who had, I hope you guys have never had to do this. He said he was now burying people he'd baptized. That's what war is. And he said to us, you know, there's one thing I will never compromise on. He says, any church that has a national objective cannot be the Church of Jesus Christ. And, you know, a bunch of liberal pastors and academics, we all applauded. But I think a lot of people believe that, you know, that you can have those two things. And you indicated it early, Paris. They cherry pick the Bible verses they want to fit the theology that they like, that allows them to do whatever they want. But, you know, theologian Rosemary Ruther said, you know, the church came into the world in part to speak truth to power and to hold the powers and principalities accountable. But as soon as Constantine made it and accepted, and later the official religion of the empire, which was a very cynical move, I mean, he saw it as an opportunity to breathe life into a dying empire, it lost its ability to do that because it became the pillar of the state. As I'm sure you both know, he showed up at the Council of Nicaea and put his finger on the scale and weighed in on theological debates because he wanted them resolved in a way that would strengthen imperial power. And the church has been struggling with that ever since. Yeah. And you know, Germany, you mentioned history rhyming, and my students used to always ask me, I teach a course called Germany Under the Third Reich. Well, how did this happen? And I'm like, well, it's a lot easier to understand now. And then, you know, the churches chose to be silent or to go along to get along, or as, you know, the Pope said at the time, I don't want Germans to choose between their religion and their country. And boy, that if there was ever a devil's bargain, that was it. Well, and most of the churches in Europe made that bargain. And I think in some indirect way, they're paying the price today when you've got church attendance in most countries that's under 15%.
If that.
Well, you know, Tom, one of the things that you picked up on is that this is not a new ideology, this Christian nationalism, or even religious nationalism for that aspect. It's been occurring through down through the centuries. And one of the things that seems to be indicating across the world, wide world, is that religious nationalism is fanning the flames in a lot of diverse places. But anyway, I know you'll get to that in just a moment. But we'll sticking with the tenor and the point of which you were making. about religious nationalism. And you've already touched on its historical roots. Are there any other things that we need to be picking up on other than I forget the one of the early settlers on one of the boats off the New England coast who preached that sermon, "City on a Hill," which has been referenced by Calvin Coolidge, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, even Obama, and most particularly in recent years by Trump and such. But how in other areas has it been manifested in the U.S. in the past?
Well, and that slight misunderstanding we had back in 1861 that we had to kind of get through. You literally had an appeal to God on both sides.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
You literally had people in the Confederacy claiming that they were defending a God-ordained system of inequality, and there's more to it than that. And of course, Lincoln and the North felt they were doing God's work as well. But something I think Lincoln said applies here. That to bring this back to the present. He said he appealed to all Americans to follow the better angels of your nature. Mm-hmm. Now we have leaders who are telling us it's okay to listen to your worst demons. And I think that's what's changed. I mean, we invoked, during the Cold War, the Pledge of Allegiance became, within one nation under God, became encouraged because we were fighting godless communism. We put in God we trust under, on our money, everybody else has to pay cash, but, and that kind of thing. Yeah. But what we thought, we had perhaps moved beyond that. But the MAGA movement and I really think it's very heavily driven by a fear. And most terrible things are. And again, the Bosnian experience, one priest told me, he says, the real definition of sin isn't wrongdoing, it's fear. Mm-hmm. And I thought, what is he talking about? And Henry Nouwen said too, what does fear do? It breeds a mentality of scarcity. There's not enough this, there's not enough love, there's not enough money, there's not enough whatever. So I have to hoard. And I have to defend, and I have to do that. Well, the fear now is the loss of white male power. I mean, there's nothing anybody can do to change the fact that in a couple of decades there will be no majority population in the U.S. We will Euro-Americans, which is a term that didn't exist when the three of us were kids. In fact, will be a minority or will be a plurality. But so as a result, this clinging to this thing really appeals to a broad base of the population. And it's pretty dangerous when you've got I refuse to call him the Secretary of War, it's the Department of Defense. Right. In fact, is embracing this ideology. And what does it do? It blunts any humanity. If you think it doesn't have real world consequences, the thing to consider is this. There was an office for, the civilian casualty mitigation. Then it might not be the exact title, but their specific job, and I talked to some people who were involved in this process during the fight with ISIS, was to examine target lists and take a close look at the possibility of killing innocent civilians. Well, Pete Hegseth gutted that office. He can't eliminate it because that requires an act of Congress. So he's got a couple of people twiddling their thumbs, occupying desks there. And there were not nearly enough people really doing the kind of in-depth target analysis that might have prevented us hitting a school and killing, something like 170 kids. Mm-hmm. And that's where this Christian nationalism goes, because there is no moderation. There is no, if it's the same thing we accused the Islamist extremists of doing. If your whole approach is kill them all and let God sort them out, then where is there any empathy, humanity, or moderation? Which last I checked was, a major theme that Jesus talked about when he wasn't busy knocking over tables.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't crucify him for turning over tables. They crucified him for challenging the powers and principalities of his day.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah. Talking about the roots of all of this, I suppose that we shouldn't be all that surprised that it's rearing its head like it is now, because the antecedents have been there for a long time. David and I were just talking a little while ago about, both of us were raised Southern Baptist in the South, and we had vacation Bible school every summer for 2 weeks. Go to church for every weekday for 2 weeks, and every morning started off the same way with an assembly in the sanctuary where we said a pledge to the American flag, we said a pledge to the Christian flag, whoever came up with that, and then a pledge to the Bible. Yeah. And it never occurred to me, at least, that maybe this runs counter to when Jesus said no one can serve two masters.
Yeah.
But when you're indoctrinated into that kind of atmosphere, then it's much easier to take the next step to, we're doing God's will here by killing them all.
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about it. I was very privileged at one point to listen to and then actually sit down and have coffee with Peter Story, the Methodist Bishop of South Africa, who helped pick the Truth and Reconciliation Committee Commission. And he said he was telling us he really liked the new South African flag. He said, I could never get attached to the old one. There was too much oppression connected. He said, but much as I like the new flag, I don't want it in my sanctuary because I've seen what can happen when that takes place. And then back to the Nazi Germany example, it was only when, sadly, it was they were a day late and a Deutschmark short in speaking out when the Nazis moved in and put in flags in the sanctuaries, and Hitler insisted he should be allowed to appoint the Reichsbishop, and National Socialism was God's new revelation in history. And Bonhoeffer and others, and far too few, stood up and said, wait a minute, if there's ever a distinction between God and Caesar, this is it. Yeah. And that's the most misunderstood, that's one of many misunderstood passages. My understanding is, when Jesus said, show me the coin, well, the very fact that the elders had a coin with a graven image on it was actually embarrassing them. They weren't supposed to do that. Exactly, yeah. He wasn't saying whatever Caesar does is okay. That wasn't the message. No, but there are people who believe it is.
Yeah. Which goes back to what you were talking about the cherry picking of certain scriptures. Yeah. But so if we've got this situation now, that begs the question in my mind about how has it become so intensified in recent years? I mean, I personally feel like I've been seeing this build up for a number of years. But what's led us to the point to where we are now?
Because our leaders have empowered people that it's okay to say these things. I mean, I think we all know that racism wasn't invented in the last decade, but it had become covert, it had become coded. Doesn't mean we still didn't have to struggle against it, but people have been given permission to speak and say these hateful kind of things. They've been given permission by their political leaders. That in fact, it's okay to say things. And what's really frightening to me is there are people in the pulpit telling them that it's okay.
Oh, God, yeah.
Yeah, and that to me is an abrogation of everything I think that Scripture stands for. Now, I think if we're going to probably get to this at some point, and that is, I'm not giving up either my flag or my church to the far right. I'm in this fight, if not for myself, for my kids and my grandkids, that it's my church. And I'm not going to, if we're in it, I think we're in a wilderness period, maybe we're the faithful remnant. I don't want to be presumptuous, but I think we have to struggle. And we have to speak, we have to say this, you don't speak for us. This isn't what it is. I mean, I was horrified to hear another podcaster, various others saying that there's such a thing as the sin of empathy.
Yeah. Oh, gosh, yeah.
I thought empathy was the whole point.
Yeah. What a segue. You and I did a whole episode on that. We called it Sympathy for Empathy.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So go back and listen to that one, folks.
I was going to say, it was really
there you go. He didn't put me up to that, everybody.
That's right. Yeah, we didn't pay you to do
that. That was not a paid political announcement. I just happened to. Great minds just work alike. That's
right. That's right. Some years ago, a friend of mine sent me a video of a pastor who, I am not kidding, this was an actual church worship service where the pastor was up there preaching about how horrible it was that we were making it okay for men to sit down when they pee. I mean, that was the gist of his sermon, you know. I mean, and he was all mad about that. And
he was pissed off about it.
He's pissed off, right?
Well, you know, and I think if you touch on something that's extremely important, he was hinting at another major theme in Hegseth's worldview, and in this toxic, you know, in this kind of thing, and that is toxic, what we call toxic masculinity, this hyper masculinity. They used to call it in the 19th century in Britain muscular Christianity, this kind of machismo, because the British had the same thing. They were in the civilizing mission to, you know, the white man's burden and all that. And that had elements of appropriation of Christian theology as well. Sure. But, you know, that there, you know, that weakness, that compassion and empathy and loving your neighbor is actually a form of weakness. And of course, your neighbor is only those people who look like you, sound like you, act like you, and have the same values as you.
Yeah, like the ICE agent who was going around grabbing people off the streets here in the Chicago area saying, you don't look like you belong here.
Well, and in a few cases, what is truly, you know, is truly mind-boggling to me, and it shouldn't be, given the work that I do, you know, the two individuals who shot, you know, the one man up in Minnesota are maybe second, third generation, you know, Hispanic, you know, children of immigrants. I mean, it's like, but that's not unusual in the American story. I mean, there was a saying, you know, one African-American colleague of mine told me once, he goes, you know, I'm willing to bet the first word that many immigrants learned was the N-word. Because the minute they got into the country, they were no longer at the bottom of the heap.
Right.
And, you know, and to some degree, I mean, that's what's going on. But again, you know, somebody has to give people, a lot of people are capable of this, but somebody has to empower them. And I wrote a whole article on the whole thing with what ISIS become is the exact thing that Hitler had as well, and Mussolini and Stalin and everybody else, which is a private army, a Praetorian Guard, a group of individuals who feel they're neither police or military. They're armed like military, but they lack the discipline of military and the discipline of police. And what do they end up being? The thugs that we're seeing doing what they're doing now. Yeah. And nobody denies you've got to have some kind of enforcement ability for immigration, but not like this. You know, this isn't who we are, you know, or who we should be. Let's put it that way. And you know, the other frustrating thing, and I'm sure you've all encountered it, is, you know, the pressure from, oh, you can't be political because you might upset people. Well, Jesus was pretty, you know, I always say you should not be blatantly partisan. But as I read the scriptures, Jesus was pretty political. You know, he did challenge he challenged he crossed boundaries, he broke rules, he challenged power structures, but got him killed. You know, and I'm not saying every sermon should be a diatribe, but on the other hand, you know, to have nothing to say about the evils that are going on, you know, I think is a dereliction of duty. I have the same feeling about educators too, by the way.
Well, and that's one of the things about Paris and I feel is that we have a responsibility, and partly it's who we are, is that and why we have this podcast is that we are or try to be interpreters of life, and interpreters, you know, of the dynamics that are occurring around us, and that cause us to be who we are, and maybe can provide a roadmap to where we can become. And we try to do that as, you know, interpreters of spirituality especially. And for the both of us, you know, spirituality begins with Jesus. And for us, that means we don't exclude people from other faiths, or even we don't exclude people who have no faith at all. And we think it's clear that Jesus practiced this bit of radical inclusion.
Yes.
And even taught us that, you know, even if you are at the bottom of the heap, to start to embrace all people,
right?
Because Jesus never, you know, Jesus did not reject anyone, and he also, and Paris, I think you phrased it very well when you said Jesus rejects all forms of coercive power.
Yeah.
That was a great line that you had.
Well,
he
good.
comes up with something good every once in a while.
Yeah, I hear somebody else say something good, and I pass it along.
Oh yeah, he's
But and one of the things of which our dear listeners, and we thank Tom for for bringing this to our attention, and Tom speak more to this, is that Christian nationalism and the way it's unfolding in the American landscape is the very antithesis of Jesus' life and teachings. Now, Tom, you've already been saying and speaking to that very well. He's doing better at it than we do. And,
I don't know about that. I only have to do it for a half hour. You guys do it every week. I mean,
but that raises a good question, Tom. For us, how can we, in dealing with this question, what can we do about it in our pulpits, and how can we empower our people in the pew? Now, I'll just specifically reference my congregation here. I have a very purple congregation. And probably it leans maybe an inch more to the
Utch?
And that's a southern
That's a pretty good southern word. Yeah,
that's a good southern expression. It's an utch. It's not much of a. It's not as much as a pinch. But I have.
We lost Tom. He didn't know what we're talking about.
well, you guys, you confirmed. I kind of thought you might be from somewhere different, but I wasn't sure.
Well, Tom, as I said, I'm from the south side of Chicago. I'm from the far
south. Yeah.
But seriously, what can we do as pastors to help for our congregations, and also how do we help empower our people about how to be aware of Christian nationalism and how they can engage it in their own lives, and even maybe in their own home frameworks, especially, at Easter dinner, Thanksgiving, Christmas, when you got all the relatives over. You know what I'm talking about.
Oh, I've seen it more than once. We used to have a rule book for Thanksgiving dinner, but I have a sneaking suspicion that somewhere around Pentecost or shortly after that, you had 12 very confused individuals in Israel, Palestine, sitting down and saying, "Okay, now what do we do?" And I suspect that's the question. And I think something Václav Havel, the former playwright and or poet perhaps, and president of the Czechoslovakia before it split up, said, what he did under communism when they had no power: live honestly. Don't go along, challenge when you can, do so gently, in all kinds of ways. I can tell you a kind of story, and Paris knows this. We had printed up some signs at our church that has the 3 verses from the Holy Quran, the Hebrew Bible, and the New Testament about loving your neighbor. And I thought, okay, put a sign, what difference does it make? Well, a neighbor came by one day and he said, well, my son's getting bullied at school because of the way he looks, his ethnicity, and she said, what are my rights? Whatever, and I kind of said, well, you know where we stand on this. And I kind of referenced science. She goes, yeah, I know. And it was kind of like, okay. So in other words, I sent a message out that Martha and I are people you can talk to. And this is where we stand. It's a real small thing, and I would have set out, this isn't going to make any difference, but you never know. So at every opportunity you can do that. And the other is, I think, I don't know how exactly to say this, but the art of gentle engagement, because I think everybody now is so into their corner, it's hard not to come out swinging. So I've tried to say to people, well, can you help me understand why you feel that way? And then, that maybe can open the door to, well, okay, I see how you feel, but have you thought about this? Now, I would love to tell you I always do that with great success and great patience, but I think Paris knows me too well to believe that. I fall short on a lot of the things. And then in whatever ways that we are personally empowered to do it. Not everybody. I mean, there was a theologian named Elizabeth Bettenhauser who said it brilliantly once. He says, those of us on the left become so convinced that we've got to be the loud prophetic voice. She said, the prophetic voices are like leaven in bread. You really want bread that's 90% yeast? You know, you really, not everybody's called to do this or is able to. But you do it with your podcast. I do it with my editorials. I've also spoken a lot in churches. And I think and then we have to, you can always tell your congregants, I'm not going to tell you how to vote, but I am going to tell you to vote. I'm going to tell you to be engaged. I am going to tell you to be informed. The other is, churches are great venues for having a conversation. In other words, I'll come out to your church and talk about, the war in Iran and talk about whatever you want. I mean, I'm sure I will irritate some people, but, as long as you create an opportunity for people to be heard, you can do it. We also have to steer away from this, all points of view are, acceptable. That's not true. There are boundaries and there are limits. I mean, David, from the Presbyterian Book of Order, you may not judge classes of people. Now, we took a long time to get around, making that truly, to live that out. We're still working on it, but, that's where we are. So all of that's a lot easier to lay out in a podcast and a lot harder to live out in reality. But, I think we just keep on keeping on.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that occurs to me too is for people who are people of faith, I have long been concerned that within some religious traditions, the study of Scripture has just gone by the wayside.
Mm-hmm.
And what's happened is in some ways we've ceded that quote unquote biblical ground to what has now become Christian nationalism. And I always want to make the case that the Bible is your book too. You don't need, just because you might, in the United Church of Christ that I belong to, everybody's scared that they might look like evangelicals, so they just don't say anything. I think that's a mistake, because as we indicated earlier, what Christian nationalism does with the Scriptures is just criminal, in my opinion. But we've got to have that common ground of what the words say and don't say before we can have any kind of meaningful dialogue about it.
I totally agree with you. And I was raised Roman Catholic, and then I fell in love with a woman who wanted to be a Presbyterian minister, and the rest is 46 years of history and going strong. And one thing I dearly love about we're now in the same church as Paris, UCC, but she's still a enrolled Presbyterian minister. I said, I really love ministry of all believers, and I can't understand why Protestants don't take it more seriously.
You mean the priesthood of all believers?
Yeah, priesthood or ministry of all believers. I'm kind of like, guys, what an empowerment. I was in a pray, pay, and obey church. It's gotten better.
That's great.
Yeah, I told you we'd find some humor. But the thing is, you're absolutely right. Now, of course, as your role is to guide people and so on. But exactly right. I mean, someone once said one of the problems with people who call themselves spiritual and are also engaged politically is the people who do the marches don't read the Bible, and the people who read the Bible don't necessarily make their voices heard, as though those two are antithetical. So I think you're absolutely right. We get lazy about our Christianity. We want you guys to do it for us.
Exactly.
We would pay you to do this for us. You take care of, tell us what to read, to believe, and say a few challenging things occasionally, but don't make us too uncomfortable. Just and I think you're right. I think that's a formula for authoritarianism.
it's a negative space in which authoritarianism can step
Yeah.
in and take hold.
Yeah, the Vatican cut a deal with the Nazis in the 1930s to look, just let us have our Catholic schools and don't mess with our churches too much, and we'll basically weaken the one party in Germany, in Bavaria, the Catholic party that might have been in opposition. And the Italian Catholic Church did. Don't get me wrong. I'm not bashing Catholics. The Protestants have much to answer for as well.
Absolutely.
Yes.
But the Lateran treaties, the same thing. The Vatican cut a deal with Mussolini. The devil always keeps his bargains, but he always collects. He always takes the payment, and the payment is horrific and much more than the people who enter the agreement realize that they were signing up for.
Yeah. Well, Tom, we feel like we've just scratched the surface of a very important and timely topic. So maybe we could coerce you to come back to the garage another time soon.
Yeah, we could talk
Keep this
about
discussion
Christian
going.
Zionism, which is another really cheerful topic. We can talk about religious extremism in the U.S., which, by the way, they've taken off the FBI's watch list now. It's all the terrors on the left. So.
Oh wow. Yeah,
Oh,
there's still much more to explore, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, as I say, like the social workers, and say I have the same thing. Plenty of misery to keep me happy, or at least in business. On that cheerful note.
Right. Sort of like my dad always said, our family manufactured church furniture back in Georgia, and people talk about a church getting in a fight and splitting, and his line always was, "Church splits are mighty good for the pew business." Yeah, well, put a rainbow on that, Dad.
Absolutely, yeah. No, yeah. Better rather to be right. We'd rather be right than united. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
That was one very good thing about the Catholic Church. You made your peace with it, and you stayed with it, and so I consider, Paris probably knows I'm probably a heretic, but in fact, I consider all these religions to be branch offices of the same headquarters, and fighting over which path up the mountain you're taking is really a huge waste of time.
Yeah, it really is, especially now.
All right. Yeah.
Well, we hear Mama calling us back to the house for supper. You're invited, Tom.
Come in, have a
I'll wash my hands and be right along.
Okay.
What are you serving?
Always fried chicken.
and
Fried
collard
chicken,
greens.
just as
collard
long as there are
greens,
no
cornbread,
collard greens, black-eyed peas, or chitlins, especially. See, I know a few things.
Yes, you do. Yeah.
A little bit of cultural.
Thou art not far from the kingdom of God.
Absolutely. There we go. That's somewhere south of Kentucky, right?
Right, yeah. So it's time for us to close the garage and head inside. So until next time, I'm Paris Donahue.
And I'm David Ezekiel, and we'll see you again here soon at the Soul's Garage. The Soul's Garage was written and recorded by David Ezekiel and Paris Donahue.
Our theme song was written by Adam and Brady Beard and Paris Donahue.
And it was performed and recorded by Adam and Brady Beard.
Our JustBarelyChristian.com website was designed and is maintained by Small Fry Marketing. And our conflict resolution specialist is Ivana Pisami.
Oh, gosh, whatever. And we'd love for you to send us your comments on Facebook or Instagram, or you can email us at thesoulsgarage@gmail.com.
Can also contact us via our website at justbarelychristian.com.
And it'd make us happy as a duck on a June bug if you could click that follow button on whatever platform you're using to listen to or watch us. And it'd be particularly helpful to Paris's self-esteem. You see, he's always been ugly. Why? He's so ugly he has to sneak up on a water fountain just to get a drink of water. So show some compassion, folks.
And as always, the Soul's Garage is a production of Two Old Geezers Studio.